welcome to Interpreting India. Geopolitical realignments, sustainable growth, healthcare financing, inclusive digital transformations, climate change, supply chain disruptions, urbanization, and several other critical global matters envelop the world as India holds the G20 presidency. We at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. I'm your host Shibani Mehta, and in this episode of Interpreting India, we'll take a closer look at how China views the Indo-Pacific region. In the last decade, there has been a growing convergence of global powers on the Indo-Pacific, evident from the proliferation of multilateral initiatives in the region. It has also emerged as an arena for geopolitical competition between China and the United States. As the competition intensifies, how does China conceptualize its role in the Indo-Pacific? How will Beijing's foreign policy choices impact the region's security environment? What can India learn from the mental map through which China views the Indo-Pacific? Joining us today to discuss these questions and more is Manoj Kewalramani. Manoj is Fellow China Studies and the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies Programme at the Takshashila Institution. His research interests range from Chinese politics, foreign policy, and approaches to new technology, to addressing questions of how India can work with like-minded partners to deal with challenges presented by China's rise. Manoj is the author of Smokeless War, China's Quest for Geopolitical Dominance, which discusses China's political, diplomatic, economic, and narrative responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Hi Manoj, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Interpreting India. This, I should say, is a long time coming. I wanted to do an episode on the Indo-Pacific, and you were the first person that I thought of, and I'm really glad it worked out. So thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much, Shivani. It is my pleasure to finally be chatting with you again, formally like this. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll get right into it. So the Indo-Pacific is something that we in foreign affairs and international affairs talk about a lot, write about a lot. And I just was thinking about it as a concept, where it started, and what it means for the world today. So Rory Metcalfe describes the Indo-Pacific as a place, an idea, and a wave of sweeping global diplomacy. If we look at the geographical boundaries of the Indo-Pacific, it stretches from East Africa to the west coast of North America, and essentially encompasses a large number of countries that are at various stages of development. They all have distinct policy objectives and diverse interests. Like I was saying, the term itself has become standard language to reflect a region of growing connectivity between two oceans. But much of how this vision is shaped is driven by how many nations define the China challenge and what is their approach to it. So my first question for you is, how does China see the Indo-Pacific, and how does it conceptualize its role in the region?
Right. So, good question, right? I mean, from my mind, I agree with Rory's description of the Indo-Pacific, but I would also say that, and I think he's alluding to that when he says that it's an idea. It is a strategic construct, right? All such geographies that we create, in fact, all such geographies, apart from what is actually, what may be actual geographical structures, what we create are strategic imaginations, right? So the idea of South Asia is a strategic imagination. The idea of West Asia, the idea of MENA, those regions are strategic imaginations. And the Indo-Pacific is also a strategic reimagination from my perspective of where the sort of gravity of geopolitical contestation and geoeconomic heft today lies. I think some of the data that you will see is that it's home to 65% of the world's population, accounts for over 60% of global GDP, 46% of all merchandise trade. So essentially, it's implicit that this is the area which encompasses among the most vibrant economies and also rising, global powers, and that's why sort of this reconceptualization is critical, right? So I think so to that degree I sort of agree. In terms of how China views the Indo-Pacific, I think that from the very early stages, at least in the last decade and a half, from when this term became gradually much more popularly used, I think Beijing sort of saw it with a deep sense of anxiety to begin with. I mean, that anxiety at certain periods of time was coupled with a certain degree of dismissiveness, because it saw itself as a central actor in terms of the global economy. It saw the Indo Pacific framing as essentially trying to bring India into what was the Asia Pacific. And that too, from Beijing's perspective, over the last sort of decade and a bit, has essentially been a geopolitical gambit from the American side to try and restructure the strategic geography of the region, redefine the nature of competition with China. And so, therefore, there was anxiety that was coupled with dismissiveness. Why did the dismissiveness occur? Why did the dismissiveness persist? Partly because there's a sense of dismissiveness, or at least there used to be a sense of dismissiveness around India's potential capabilities to emerge as a regional challenger to China, but also because there was a sense that the Obama era pivot to Asia didn't really amount to much, so it didn't really yield anything. Therefore, this idea of the Indo-Pacific might just be one of those ideas which is floated out there and then which sort of doesn't seem to actually take hold, because the realities of the region and the centrality of China to regional but also global trade and global economics, and any key major issue in world affairs today, will necessitate that this competitive view of the Indo-Pacific doesn't sort of persist, right? So I think from Chinese perspective, there was I go back to some papers that were written which talked about how studies were launched within China to try and understand what exactly does the Indo-Pacific mean in the conceptualization of the US and also other countries. I think once Donald Trump was among the first US presidents to use this phrase, right? And since then, there were studies in 2017, 2018 in China, and those studies were significantly funded by government support. And they looked at the Indo-Pacific strategies of different countries, right? They looked at the US, ASEAN, India, IPC as a Indo-Pacific as a concept, and what they realized was that there's still significant conceptual immaturity. I think that's changed today, and perhaps we can talk about that going forward.
I agree with you completely on the anxiety and sort of dismissiveness that China holds against the concept of the Indo-Pacific. And when you said dismissiveness, I was reminded of the quote that's often cited of the Chinese, I think, foreign minister that said that the Indo-Pacific is a concept that will, float away like the foam between the two oceans. Um, you mentioned towards the end of your response that there is a certain change in how Beijing views the Indo-Pacific as a concept, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I think this is over the last, particularly towards the end of the Trump administration, and now with the Biden administration, now that we have clear documents starting from 2019 from the US. So in 2019, you had a US Department of Defense Indo-Pacific strategy document. Under Biden, you have a proper Indo-Pacific strategy document. Both those have very clear articulations of what kind of regional order and thereby given global order the US wants to shape, and what kind of capabilities it wants to bring forth to shape that. In terms of military capabilities, the effort is clearly to try and not just revitalize American alliances, but also to change force posture to be able to have much more forward positioned American troops, much more nimble force posture, which can respond to contingencies in China's near seas. At the same time, the US is looking at expanding and deepening its partnerships with countries like India. AUKUS was signed. So all of those shifts are something that Beijing noticed. Um, at the same time, I think the Indo-Pacific strategy document of the US actually specifically talks about supporting India to emerge as a key regional player, right? It talks about things like diversification of supply chains and all those kinds of things. So, from Beijing's perspective, increasingly the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US and the conceptualization of the regional order as Indo-Pacific started to seem like an effort at trying to craft a policy of containment. Now, the Ukraine war sort of came at an interesting time from China's perspective, because what since has been seen is that it believes that as much as the US is now sort of is competing on two fronts with an active European front and also competing with China in the Indo-Pacific, from Chinese perspective, the US is trying to create linkages between these two domains. And the key process of doing that is to get NATO much more engaged in the Indo-Pacific. So over the last 3 years, we've seen NATO documents reference the Indo-Pacific. And this latest summit in Vilnius was quite direct, where it talked about, how what happens there is clearly in our interests. And there is discussion of trying to open a NATO liaison office in Japan. There's discussion of, there was some sort of ideas floated in DC about the possibility of offering India a NATO plus, sort of status and things like that. So I think that those are the kinds of things that it is looking at, and China looks at those and says that, look, the US is trying to essentially create under its Indo-Pacific strategy a NATO-like, or if not just NATO-like, a NATO-light structure to try and contain China. And the Indo-Pacific strategy essentially implies that. So therefore, this sense of anxiety, the sense of dismissiveness is now gone. Now it is sense of anxiety, and the sense of anxiety has led to quite a vitriolic pushback uh, to even the use of the phrase. Constantly, you'll see Chinese media articles and commentaries and analysts use, when they use the Indo-Pacific, it will be used in quotation marks critically, and they'll say, "Well, this is just containment in the garb of something new." So I think that's how the perception has changed. That from being, something that was firm on the seas, to something which is much more sinister. And I think that's how Chinese perceptions have changed, and therefore even the pushback has come uh, to try and discredit any ideas of the Indo-Pacific.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that this pushback is coming from a place of anxiety because, I mean, it is one of the questions I had for you that China officially doesn't use the term Indo-Pacific in any foreign policy documents, any statements that it makes. Like you said, it's referred to in quotation marks or as a critique of, say, the US Indo-Pacific strategy, where they're calling out the United States for wanting to maintain hegemony in the region or sort of, like you said, contain China and the rise of China. At the same time, there has been an increase in the use of the term when it comes to commentary and media reports. Um, I was also reading an article by Shamsal, and this was from a few years ago, but he said that think tanks are organizing a lot of conferences and events that have Indo-Pacific as the key theme. So for me, it appeared as, there is a fragmented approach to the region. And in one way, you're not officially sort of acknowledging the concept, but you're also trying to create a narrative around it that is more positive and sort of reflects positively on you. So would you say that this fragmentation is part of China's approach to the region, or is it just simply about owning the narrative and trying to turn it around to spin it in a way that's more positive?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, look, studies into the concept, like I said, well, like I also said in my opening remarks, that, around 2017, 2018, which is when I think 2017 is when Trump used the phrase Indo-Pacific. The first American senior official to use the phrase was then Secretary of State Tillerson. And then following that, Trump, I think when he was visiting Vietnam in 2017, in late 2017, he had used the term Indo-Pacific, and subsequently we saw it used much more frequently in American discourse. And around the same time, Chinese sort of academic studies into the Indo-Pacific sort of increased, right? So there's a paper by Boma from some years ago, which has details up to 2019, and it highlights that around 2016 there were about less than about 5 or 6 papers which dealt with the subject of the Indo-Pacific. So academic papers, Indo-Pacific strategy. In 2017, there were again just 3 or 4. But by 2018 and 2019, that shot up to between 40 to 50 papers that dealt with the idea of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Um, these studies were conducted by, overwhelmingly by Chinese universities and government think tanks and military think tanks. So there was a significant number of them that were done by them, and a lot of these were funded by state grants, right? So it was clear that the Chinese leadership was very interested in trying to understand what exactly does this Indo-Pacific strategy mean, and what does it mean for different entities, right? To that extent, there was an interest in trying to understand the concept and what it might mean, and what are the interpretations of the concept for different states. And I would assume that today, that 3 years ago, if we were to have asked somebody sitting in Bangladesh, what does the Indo-Pacific mean to you? Their interpretation of that might be very different from somebody sitting in Delhi or somebody sitting in Seoul. So I think this is what the Chinese were trying to understand as to how are different states characterizing this strategic construct. Do they fundamentally see it as a binary between the US and China, or do they see it as essentially the linking of markets of this large domain, and therefore an opportunity? So I think that is what it was trying to understand. What it has understood of late is that the idea of the Indo-Pacific uh, is fundamentally a threat to China's centrality in the Asia and Asia Pacific, um, because it is a geopolitical construct of trying to create balancing coalitions with regard to China. And I think the US Indo-Pacific strategy and then the Biden administration further sort of drew a line under this, that this is what we are trying to do. Um, and I think that's where Chinese posture has started to change. I don't think that there is necessarily a discourse around the Indo-Pacific as using the construct as being something positive. I think, um, in fact, Chinese government policy, party diplomacy, and mainstream media have tried to create and coin alternate narratives of order. For example, Xi Jinping's big slogan for world order is the community of common future or common destiny for mankind. Under that, you've got now these different initiatives, from the Belt and Road to the global security, the global development, and the global civilization initiative. None of these talk about the Indo-Pacific as a region, right? Because that is, from a Chinese lens, that is constraining Chinese activities within the boundaries of between these two oceans. And Beijing looks at itself as a global player. So it doesn't necessarily want to accept this, but it does want to understand how others are viewing this strategic construct, so that you can craft your own policy responses based on what others' approaches are, what their anxieties are, what their senses of opportunity are. So I think that's where the studies have largely been focused. I think that, as a concept, if you were to ask the Mandarins in Beijing, they would tell you we would love for it to go away, but unfortunately, that's not going to happen.
I'm really glad that you brought up alternative orders and sort of China's quest to kind of offer an alternative to the US led / Western liberal global order. Um, Again, there appears to be this very obvious contradiction in sort of China's professed adherence to a rule based order, whereas, but you're also, a lot of your actions appear to kind of sorry, I'm just going to take that again. Um, I'm glad that you brought up the alternative that China is trying to offer through its, the Global Security Initiative, the BRI, and other sort of initiatives. It says, but if you look at the Global Security Initiative, a lot of the narrative is that it will adhere to the UN-based rules. There's not going to be any disruption. So that's the narrative, and that it's going to adhere to this existing system. But in terms of action, like you said, it's about establishing Chinese centrality, a regional order in which China is the key player. How do we make sense of this contradiction?
Yeah, good question. Look, from Beijing's perspective, when it sees what's happening to the international order, and I define the international order as a set of institutions where states are your primary actors, and there is a certain set of binding norms that they have agreed to. And I don't want to sort of ascribe to it liberal or illiberal values, but that's how I would define the international order. And these institutions are quite clear: the WTO, the UN, and the agencies, and so on and so forth, and even regional institutions. Now, what China is saying is that it is the US which is being revisionist. Um, and there is a certain amount of merit to what they are saying, because of course the United States has been revisionist. It has been revisionist. I mean, and the Trump administration was the most egregious in this when it pulled out of agreed international agreements. It pulled out of UN agencies. So and it has, and not just the Trump administration, but as a whole, the US government has, say, for example, paralyzed the operation of the WTO because it has not agreed to the grievance redressal mechanism changes. So I think that some of those challenges that Beijing highlights do resonate and do make sense. At the same time, of course, China has also not shown too much regard for certain norms that it professes that it adheres to. For example, sovereignty and peaceful resolution of disputes, territorial integrity. We know that in India, countries know that in the South China Sea. China's sort of normative, I mean, in terms of its lack of criticism of or any sort of pushback with regard to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. All of those tell you that it's viewing these norms predominantly from the lens of its own interests. But yet, what is the kind of normative architecture that China is trying to project and profess and build? It is fundamentally an architecture around the idea of sovereignty, of state sovereignty, where essentially there is and should be very little to no interference in how states organize, how societies organize themselves within their national boundaries. And those national boundaries should be inviolable. Now, of course, in the examples that I've given, Beijing itself has violated those boundaries, and Beijing itself has not respected or criticized countries which have violated those boundaries. And that's a function of power. But the order that it is comfortable with is one in which sovereignty is there is the primacy of sovereignty, and those national boundaries are respected in every sense of the word. So it's not just in terms of violation of territorial integrity, but also in terms of governance norms at home, whether that is with regard to individual rights, whether that is with regard to you know governance of cyberspace, whether that is with regard to governance of technology, whether that is with regard to political systems and political participation, whether that is with regard to economic freedom. What it does not want is interference, and that is the kind of world that it is arguing for. Now, when if you want to build that sort of a world, um, at the end of the day, in theory, yes, sovereign states are all equal. Yet there are obviously clear power differentials, and what you will end up having is a world akin to sort of the 1800s, great power system where you have some degree of spheres of influence that are constructed. And my understanding of how the Chinese articulate this, and this is, I think, articulated largely through the Global Civilization Initiative, is that there has to be a civilizational sphere of influence in some ways, right? Um, and that is something that they are comfortable with because they see themselves as a key civilizational player. So this will be a world order in which sovereignty is key, civilizational influence matters, which is cultural influence matters. But at the same time, there is little interference in domestic affairs of countries. And thereby, there is respect for diversity of governance modes and models. And where those diverse systems and interests intersect or clash, there must be, I mean, power will fundamentally determine where those deals are settled, but there must be some degree of negotiated settlement. That's what it's ideally arguing. Now, the challenge with that is that when you have a system which respects diversity to this degree, you end up also creating a world in which egregious violations of rights, egregious norms of governance domestically become justifiable. So, my example for this is the Taliban in Afghanistan. In a world where everybody can claim civilizational heritage authorizes such forms of certain forms of government governance, what gives anybody the right to tell the Taliban that this is problematic? Or, so the treatment of women is problematic, education of girl child not taking place is problematic. So I think that it can create quite a volatile world also. But I don't think Beijing is thinking of it from that perspective. I think what it's basically arguing is that as long as you have this diversity, it means that the Communist Party's rule has less pressure from outside forces, and it has greater capacity, at least in this region, to arrive at better outcomes because it has a relatively far greater power than any other entity in the region. So to me, that's the play that's going on now. In this process, what happens to global institutions? I think China values global institutions. It sees them as very, very useful because it sees them as legitimizing a lot of what Chinese propositions are. So you can take 100 countries with you, which are anxious about American policy, and you can push back at the UN, and you can demonstrate strength in numbers. And I think that's how it's used the UN. So I don't think that it wants to dismantle those systems. I think it wants to um, revise at some places, reform in some places to suit its own objectives. Um, and the objective is essentially this: to try and create an environment, world order, which is where sovereignty is dominant and the rest is negotiated. And perhaps that negotiated process can take place through these institutions.
So just to follow up on that, domestically, how is this viewed? Beijing's vision for a global world order, and is there something that you can tell by reading between the lines, or is it again a very elite foreign policy concept that really doesn't concern the people of China?
It's really hard to say domestically, right? Because at the end of the day, people in China have very similar aspirations to people in most parts of the world: a better life, better opportunities. You know, also there is this new sense of nationalism, which again is not unique to China. There is nationalism around the world, resurgence of nationalism around the world. So I think that to a certain degree, yes, it is this small little esoteric elite club which is discussing foreign policy affairs. It's a fairly large club, but yeah. But I think that just like I think that you can draw certain parallels with India, where you know narratives sold by the leadership back home uh, are used, narratives sold externally, sort of, or narratives in terms of foreign policy, are used to sort of support domestic legitimacy and generate domestic legitimacy. I think it's very similar in some ways. I do think that there is a certain degree of, in China's case, we call it wolf warriorism. But even in India's case, you see this assertive diplomacy. You see the use of assertive diplomacy abroad to generate domestic legitimacy. I think that there are parallels that exist. Of course, it's not a neat parallel. I mean, I think Beijing, to its own detriment, has engaged in horrible levels of assertive diplomacy, which I'm very glad to see that India has not done. But I think that that is the frame in which it is used. In terms of popular discourse, it's essentially, I think there is a deep understanding, and I wouldn't say deep understanding, I would probably say that there is a deep public sense that the United States is fundamentally looking to contain China. I think that is a sense that has percolated across the ecosystem. I think there was a survey by Tsinghua University sometime back earlier this year, uh, and you could see it from clearly from the survey's outcomes that the United States was viewed quite unfavorably, Russia was viewed quite favorably. I would wager that 15 years ago or 17 years ago that would have not been the case. So things have changed, and I think there is also a sense that this competition with the US is long term, and it's going to sustain for quite some time, and it's going to have an impact on people's lives. Um, and that, I think, is what really impacts the actual public, right? For example, the number of Chinese students in America has tumbled incredibly. The possibility of Chinese researchers and American researchers to work together, the cases against Chinese origin or Chinese national researchers in America, all of those kinds of things actually have a significant impact. And the pandemic worsened this. The fact that even today there are not too many flights compared to pre-pandemic levels between the US and China. And in fact, one of the first objectives of the Blinken visit, a month or so ago, was that, okay, let's try and get the people to people thing moving. But it's still not really happened, right? You've still not been able to move. So there is deep distrust amongst the political elites now, and that is percolated to the population, and that has a tangible impact on people. So once that happens, it's easier for these nationalistic ideas to take deeper root. And I think that's happened in China, where it is, um, these developments have built upon, what was the patriotic education campaign launched in the mid 1990s. Those individuals who learnt in the mid 1990s are in their 20s and early 30s today. So, they are the people who are driving, they are the young elite. So I think that that's sort of led to much more friction. And when that happens, you always back your side, right? So, and I think you can also see it in Chinese media, right? Chinese media, like any other media, apart from driven by political objectives of the party, are also driven by to some degree by metrics of what's happening on social media, right? So, um, the more nationalistic you are, if you're getting more hits, views, counts, whatever, it matters. And therefore, you're seeing media do that. Right? They're trying to find ways to usurp the extreme corners, which tells you a little bit about public sentiment. But yeah, otherwise, it's really difficult to get a sense of how people are thinking. You have to use these proxy methods to try and figure it out.
Yeah, and I would assume that even if we were to sort of look at Chinese, the Chinese strategy for Indo-Pacific, you'll have to use a lot of proxies because, as we were discussing earlier, even if you look at the Global Security Initiative, there is no mention of, forget the Indo-Pacific, any specific region. They do talk about bilateral relationships and building on, say, uh, connectivity with ASEAN and connectivity with Africa. But there is no as opposed to, like you said, the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. The Japanese national security strategy, which came out last year, had a full section on Indo-Pacific and the challenges that it presents. So, I mean, yeah, I totally agree with you on sort of having to use proxies and then kind of guesstimating what the facts are. Um, I wanted to go back to something that we started off with, which was the concept of the Indo-Pacific and what sort of how China views it. And you were talking about how initially the curiosity coming from China was about how does the rest of the world think of the Indo-Pacific. And so a few weeks ago, a colleague of mine like put out a world map in front of us and said, "Okay, but just mark out what you think is the Indo-Pacific, and then mark out how you think your government views the Indo-Pacific." And it was just an interesting exercise for me personally. I hadn't actually sat down and thought about it. Um, it's also interesting to compare notes then with colleagues and be like, okay, why do you think this part of Africa is in the Indo-Pacific, but not this country, and so on and so forth. Um, India, of course, views itself as an important player in the region, and I would assume that understanding the Chinese view of the Indo-Pacific is essential for India. So, how do you suppose India goes about trying to figure out, or maybe there is already an answer, there is a strategy and maybe we figured it out, but how do you get a sense of how China is looking at the region?
How do you get a sense of how China is looking at the region? I think there are a few ways that one can try and understand what the thinking is. Firstly, of course, is official discourse, right? Is whether the concept, how is the concept discussed within official and media discourse. So for example, when you mentioned Wang Yi earlier talking about foam on the seas, he also had this lovely algorithm of the Indo-Pacific, which was 54321, which meant five meant the Five Eyes, four meant the Quad, three meant AUKUS, two meant US bilateral partnerships, and one meant the United States itself. So that is essentially their understanding of what they think is happening in the Indo-Pacific. Now, what is their strategy, and how does India understand it? I mean, to me, the first thing that I think is worth looking from an Indian point of view is the fact that this derision towards the Indo-Pacific as a concept is in part a acknowledgement of India as a competitor, and therefore that being problematic, because otherwise, why would you not want, if you want India in the RCEP, what's the problem with the geopolitical construct being changed to, or geo-economic construct being changed to Indo-Pacific also? So the anxiety is with regard to India becoming a central political actor closely aligned with the United States. I mean, I think that is the first sort of thing that, from an Indian point of view, one would notice. And it also, so the corollary to that is that um, it also means that the Beijing is extremely anxious about India's relationship with the United States, and as that relationship deepens, it's likely to invite, certain kind of responses. Those responses can be coercive, those responses can be accommodative, or any other kind. What we have seen is no accommodation, a lot of coercion, which I think I would interpret from that is that Beijing believes that coercion is an effective tool to get India to back off and accede to its wishes. But also, coercion is an effective tool potentially to get India to sort of slow down in terms of its closeness with the US. Unfortunately, from a Chinese perspective, that is not what has happened. What has happened is that coercion has led India to far more tightly embrace the United States, right? And I don't think that that is necessarily a dilemma that Beijing has yet been able to solve as to whether accommodation would be a better uh, approach, or would coercion be a better approach. I don't think that we are likely to see any accommodation, at least in terms of how we've seen Chinese policies for the last 3-4 years, or what Chinese discourse is around India. Yet at the same time, when the Indian Prime Minister visited the United States recently for this historic meeting, which led to this significant deals that were signed, the Chinese discourse around that visit was quite interesting. A lot of it was, very critical of the United States for trying to, leverage India to contain China much more. And the discourse was also critical of the fact that, hey, look, these agreements sound great, but the US and China have a history of implementing grand sounding agreements, of announcing grand sounding agreements, but without necessarily following through. And the nuclear deal is sort of one such thing. But at the same time, there was also recognition, after a very long time in some Chinese commentaries, you noted the use of the phrase "major power for India." So I think that there was also, so it's unclear whether proximity with the United States will lead to accommodation or whether it will lead to much more coercion. To me, at present, coercion is what's likely. So I think from an Indian perspective, if I'm looking at what China's strategy is, I think that's what I would see. That they want us to not be as close to the US, not be supportive. And as we get closer, their anxieties rise, and therefore there will be reactions. The sweet spot for us would be that we get closer and we also get accommodation, but that's not happening at the moment. In terms of how China approaches the region beyond India, I think that it looks at the region very differently from this framework of the Indo-Pacific, because from the American lens, the Indo-Pacific is predominantly a maritime construct. From the Indian lens, it is a maritime construct, but it is also a continental construct. So we have also got continental challenges, which namely in Pakistan, in China, in Afghanistan, and terrorism. So therefore, our policies and our interests from the US might differ in that. From a Chinese perspective, looking at the Indo-Pacific and framing policies simply within this context would be playing the game on somebody else's terms. So therefore, the initiatives that we talked about are global development, global security, global civilization. The primary objective is to free frame your regional architecture, but the vision is global because you don't want to constrain yourself to the region. And your region is sort of, your experimental domain, right? So when they talked about the Global Security Initiative, uh, China talked about having a demonstration zone in the Lansang Mekong region for the GSI, which tells you that China doesn't view the Indo-Pacific as a whole; it's viewing it as sub-regions, and it engages in sub-regional cooperation in that context. So you've got China plus the Central Asia Five, China and ASEAN, China and the Lansang Mekong region, China and CELAC in Latin America, China and FOCAC with Africa. So I think that's how it's approaching the world. That it's approaching the world on its own terms, and it sees that acknowledging the idea of the Indo-Pacific and therefore structuring your strategies on that basis is playing the game on somebody else's terms, which it doesn't want to do. So that's how I think they are approaching it. And I think from an Indian point of view, like I said, understanding their anxieties creates opportunities and helps you understand your challenges better.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that we could have this conversation and just kind of break down this not very, but somewhat abstract concept of the Indo-Pacific. I see a lot of value in not just, using that as standard language, but also trying to dig deeper into what someone means when they actually say Indo-Pacific. And most of all, trying to look at it from the Chinese point of view. So thank you so much for sharing that. Definitely a lot of implications for India. And as we discussed, as India moves forward in its ambition as a emerging power or major power, I think it's very important to understand how the world is also thinking about India and its ambition. So thank you, Manoj. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, Shibani. This was a pleasure.
Thank you. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, subscribe to Interpreting India on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time.